watching Cablevision, Channel 31, local origination programming, your hometown network.
Welcome to Mind Over Matter. Today it's a pleasure to welcome David Karp, who is a professor of sociology at Boston College, who's written several books, which I think he will reference. But one of the books in particular, The Burden of Sympathy, is going to be the focus of today's discussion. We're going to talk about the boundaries of obligation, that is to say, kind of what happens in the life of caregivers. And how do they go about setting proper limits when they're called upon to take care of someone who has mental illness. So on behalf of the Norfolk Alliance, welcome.
Thank you.
And perhaps we could start with some definition of what the problem is that led you to write the two books, and we'll go from there.
Yeah. I began really this venture because of my own mental illness. I'm a person who has suffered from depression in greater or lesser degree since my early 30s. I'm a 56-year-old guy now. Mm-hmm. And I feel very fortunate that I live a life that allows me, in my academic work, to work on puzzles in my own life. I wrote a book that was published in 1996 called Speaking of Sadness. Like all of my work, and The Burden of Sympathy also, it's based on lengthy conversations with people, in-depth interviews. I like to think of them as artful conversations.
Artful?
Artful conversations, like this one, I hope.
Yep.
And I will only say about Speaking of Sadness that I'm concerned less about the causes of depression and how to cure depression in that book, but rather with the experience of living with depression, how people go about the business of making sense of a really difficult life circumstance. It would take all of our time to tell you all the things that happened to me after Speaking of Sadness was published, personal things, intellectual things. But let me just simply say here that I came to feel that that book had told only half of a story. And the other half of the story, I increasingly became convinced, are the stories of the parents and the spouses and the children and the siblings of people suffering from a major and catastrophic mental illness. I might just say that when I got serious about writing what became The Burden of Sympathy, I had had a long association with a group called MDDA. You probably know MDDA, the Manic Depressive and Depressive Association. I think at the national level it might be called DMDA. And I had been a member for many years, and I knew there was an affiliated family and friends group. And so when you don't leap into things that are likely to be 5-year projects without feeling that they're really going to go somewhere. And I asked permission to sit in as an observer in the family and friends group. And they've been incredibly gracious about letting me sit there. I've been there now for over 4 years. The book is published. I keep going because the stories are so powerful and so engaging.
Do you tell your own, or are you just an observer?
Well, I'm there primarily as an observer in that group. I was just bowled over by the stories that I heard. I was bowled over by the pain of the stories, the difficulty, the tragedy of many of the stories, but I should also say the courage and the heroism of many of the stories. And it didn't take long. So I spent 6 months. As I said, I've continued to be a member of that group. I continue to go. But after 6 months of listening to these stories, I really decided that these other stories had to be told, and I couldn't find other places where the stories of caregivers to the mentally ill really had been told.
That's true. Let me just ask you a question, though, because you started on a personal note, so let me ask you a personal question. Because I noticed in your first book that you began to experience some difficulty, but it was 4 years later that you asked for help. At least that's how I remember.
I don't
now, did you feel in retrospect that you were a burden to a caretaker system?
Well, I'm pretty self-revealing at the beginning of Speaking of Sadness, and there's a line in there that says that I don't remember exactly how I said it, but that it's remarkable that my wife is still with me. I mean, we're married for 32 years, and so I think I have some understanding of what maybe a caregiver goes through with somebody who is depressed. But I certainly didn't have the full sense of it until I began to hear these stories. And when I then began to interview people, many of them, of the 60 people that I interviewed for this book, are people who were members of that group, and then I got other people via newspapers and a variety of other ways. It didn't take long into these interviews to realize that the central conundrum for caregivers, the central problem that they keep going back to, and every Wednesday night it comes up over and over again, to use the words of the people themselves, the question that they keep raising is, how do I draw the line? How do I draw the line between myself and the ill person? And what they realize early on in the what I think of as a sort of a joint career of caregivers and mentally ill people, what they realize early on is that wherever they draw the line, like that proverbial line in the sand, to complete the metaphor here, the gusty winds of mental illness come and blow the line away, and the line has to be redrawn and redrawn and redrawn and redrawn yet again.
Has to.
Yes, I think that people find that wherever they try to draw this boundary, wherever they try to decide, what do I owe this person, how close to be to this person, how distant to be from this person, when they think they've got a formula for doing it, things change. And in some ways, the whole career, as I see it at least from these stories, of caregivers becomes a kind of an ongoing construction project in line drawing. It's not as though you decide once and for all how you're going to draw this boundary between yourself and an ill person. It has to be constantly renegotiated.
Now, can you dwell on that for a moment? Why? I mean, why can't I say, I will go this far and no further? I mean, what happens to me that I'm pressured into sort of moving the line?
Yeah. Well, I think what happens is that people who are new to mental illness as caregivers don't know how this is going to unfold. And I might say that one of the things that I'm interested in this book, and I think a theme throughout the book, is on process. I'm interested in how this relationship between caregivers and ill people, how it evolves over time. And so when mental illness first comes home, if you want to put it that way, there is, for example, a chapter in this book. The third chapter is called Managing Emotions. And certainly the experience of caregiving from beginning to end is an exercise in managing emotions, all of the emotions, anger and frustration, and yes, the whole array of emotions that you can imagine. But what I think happens is that the emotions that predominate, I'll just use this example of emotions for the moment, it shifts over time. So for example, at the moment when mental illness first begins to appear, I mean, you said it took me 4 years to get to a doctor. I mean, if a kid is an adolescent, let's say, parents get confused. They don't know whether this is just, unusual behavior, adolescent behavior. It takes a while to begin to realize, until something really awful happens sometimes, that mental illness is in the picture. And so for a long period of time, people experience what I call, in the beginning of this chapter, emotional anomie. Anomie is a word, a sociological word that comes from 19th century writers. It means literally normlessness. And what I mean to convey with this here is that people are just absolutely confused. The dominant emotion is confusion. Somewhere along the line, at least in the cases of the people that I interviewed, the person that they love gets diagnosed. The moment of diagnosis in this career is a critical benchmark because for the first time, they, first of all, have a medical definition of what's wrong. People in this book, you may remember some of them saying, boy, the day I got the diagnosis was the best day of my life. It was incredible to get the call from the doctor and to learn what's wrong with my brother or my child or my husband. And I think what happens is that that moment of diagnosis sets in motion a different relationship to the person. A person who's been diagnosed with a medical condition, a mental illness, deserves the sympathy that is owed to anybody who has a major illness. So the emotion shifts from confusion to sympathy. Let me just take it one step further.
Sure.
The hope, I think, for many people at the beginning who don't know a great deal about mental illness is that if you get persons taking the right pills, that this is a problem that's going to get fixed. And I hope, I think it perhaps is the case that many people do get on the right medications and things work really well for them. But for many of these people, that early hope that this thing is going to get fixed, we'll get the person on the right medication, it's going to go away, they have to come to the gradual realization that that's not going to happen. And a third moment is the recognition that this might be permanent. And so each of these moments creates a different frame for understanding your relationship to the ill person. When it becomes permanent, the harsher emotions of frustration, sometimes anger, what is the responsibility of the other person now? Are they doing their part? Are they following the doctor's orders? Are they staying on their medications? And at that moment in this history, and this history can take, it's not that these stages happen with absolute regularity, can sometimes the recognition of permanence can usher in all kinds of feelings, some of them very negative, like hate.
So it's a process. So
it's a process.
But during the first phase, I mean, we're not to the burden quite yet. In the first phase, where we're into, because the sympathy becomes a burden, and we'll talk about that after the break, but during the first phase, you may not necessarily be drawing lines. You're just simply
trying to figure it out
for the sick member and trying to figure it all out. So you may not be at where you're drawing lines. That comes later, I gather.
Right.
Okay.
And I think part of this also is, and this really gets to the question of the boundary, is that at a certain point people begin to feel swallowed up by this. At a certain point people begin to feel that if they can't withdraw to some degree, they're going to get beaten up by this. I think the difficult thing for caregivers, the challenge is this. How do you, on the one hand, honor a commitment to help somebody that you love who has a terrible illness without becoming engulfed by their misery? And so it's an extremely difficult thing to know how much help to give, when to be distant. You know, the word enabling is in our vocabulary these days.
And we should talk a little about that later.
Extremely difficult questions about what do you owe. I mean, here, let me just say that I think that the fundamental question that I'm raising here, which maybe in some ways is the fundamental question of sociology, regardless of whether it is speaking to the question of mental illness, is what do human beings owe each other? Or what do I owe a member of my family who's ill? And I will also say, and maybe we could play on this a little bit later on in our conversation if you'd like, that the way that people create a calculus of care, I think of it that way, is not the same for each person. And so as a social psychologist, a sociologist, social psychologist, I'm interested in how this business of drawing the line is different for women than it is for men. Mothers, I think, when I was 6 months in the family and friends group, somebody said, "What are you learning?" And somewhat tongue-in-cheek, I said to them, I said, "Well, you know, I think I might be learning that mothers are on a different caregiving planet altogether."
Okay. Well, let's return to the calculus in a moment. We'll have to take a break, but I think that's a good point to begin with. Thank you.
Wherever you go, you see the signs. A new century is coming, and with it, 1,000 questions. Will there be peace? Will your family ever be in harm's way? Will a small town in Texas be hit with a hurricane? Will your daughter ever need a new kind of blood treatment? Will that nice man who hands you the paper ever need a hand to hold in a time of need? We have no crystal ball for the world that awaits. Just one promise. We'll be there, whether it's in the eye of the storm, in your darkest hour, in your time of need, or in the light of day. We'll be there.
get to be. It's not just where I get to meet, but where I get to go. Get to go! Get to go! It's forgive about being sick. Remembering how to be a kid. How to laugh out loud. That anything is possible. Leaving worry on the doorstep. Feeling 10 feet tall. Making plans for the future. I'm still making plans for the future. I'm still making plans for the future.
So maybe we'll continue. If you could talk a little bit about the calculus of caring and perhaps lead into the 4 C's
Okay.
that you reference in your book.
Right. I was saying that, just to pick up on where I think we left off, that I think this calculus of care is not, the arithmetic is not the same for all members of the family, and I think that one of the complexities that really is worth thinking about and that I try to pursue is how it is different depending upon one's location within the context of a family. It is different for parents than it is for a child who's grown up with a mentally ill parent than it is for a sibling. And we could explore just how some of those variations, what some of those variations might be. But regardless of those differences, there are certainly commonalities. The fundamental commonality is this question of closeness and distance. And I think that this is, since I draw so much inspiration from the self-help group, this is the ongoing question. I mean, of course, they're at various points talking about the mental health system or talking about medications, but they're constantly coming back to this question about how to cope with this. And there's a chapter actually in the book that I call the 4 C's. I don't make that up myself. I've come to think of the 4 C's as the mantra, virtually a religious mantra of this group. And the 4 C's go this way. Somewhere in the course of the 2 hours that people meet, somebody...
How often do they meet, by the way?
Once a week.
Once a week.
They meet once a week. On every other week they have a lecture, so then the sharing and caring part of it is only for an hour. But somewhere during the meeting, a veteran, somebody who's been in the group for a while, is asked to recite the 4 C's. They go this way. I didn't cause it. I can't cure it. I can't control it. All I can do is cope with it. And I think the 4 C's have a lot of wisdom. I mean, it's almost a kind of a Buddhist-like spiritual cast to the 4 C's. And I think that these are folks who are grappling, trying to live out their lives in the context of the wisdom of these ideas. But what you realize in listening to the conversations and listening to the conversations in the book is that while people might recognize the correctness of those ideas, it's very hard to live your life in those terms, so that people can say and can get the reinforcement in the group, I didn't cause this. This was not me that caused this. But it's very hard still for parents of a child, however much they might be told and believe that their child has a biological illness. It's really difficult for them not to believe that maybe they did have some part in causing this to happen. I mean, certainly there's a common sense belief that what becomes of children is in some large measure a product of the way that parents bring them up, and not just parents, but I think even more particularly mothers. So there's, I think, a lingering sense that maybe they have had somehow are implicated in the cause of this. They can believe that they can't cure this, but then they make incredibly heroic efforts on a day-to-day basis, particularly at the beginning of this sort of thing. Heroic efforts are made to try to cure this. If only I would give the person enough love, if I can show them how much they are cared about, this is going to go away. And it's very hard for family members who truly do love each other to feel that if I maybe there is something that I can do to make this thing go away. And maybe the one that takes the longest to realize, and maybe people never quite get it, is that they can't control it. Here's somebody in their family who can be behaving very badly, can behaving in ways that are, in fact, socially repugnant, behaving in ways that are scary, behaving in ways that are dangerous. And the urge is to try to control this because people need order in their lives. I mean, human beings need order in their own lives. And if you're in the middle of a family situation which is becoming increasingly chaotic because of a person's mental illness, you're trying your hardest to control this thing. And people, I think, get really wound up in this. And this is where the boundary really does get blurry. The book is called The Burden of Sympathy, and I think that what I guess I mean to convey by this is that when persons can't incorporate into their lives really the 4 C's, but get really bound up in trying to control the thing and to create a cure and so forth, they begin to get buried by this. They really begin to themselves become ill. I will tell you that I think I could say that of the 60 people that I interviewed for this book, probably 30 of them are people that I could have interviewed for the previous book on depression. They're people who are being treated for clinical depression.
But in part, you're saying because they're kind of worn down by the caretaking responsibility?
Yes. I mean, we don't normally think of mental illness as a contagious illness, and it's not contagious in the way that a virus is contagious.
Right.
But it's certainly contagious in the sense that people who are finding themselves in a traumatic situation where whatever they're doing is not working, and where often the person who is ill is not recognizing that they have an illness. This is a huge problem.
Can we go back 1 C at a time? We're up to 3, because you did talk earlier about this as a process. How long does it take, say, most people in that group to sort of begin to convince themselves? And I would say that's got to be the 5th C, convincing yourself that the first 4 are
It's not a bad idea.
accurate.
Maybe they need 5 C's.
Right, but how do you begin to shift from I didn't cause it, how do you come to accept that in your heart?
Well, but see, the word heart is really important, because I think what makes this so complicated for people, I'll try to answer the question. I don't know if I have a good answer to it, but it is a matter of both head and heart. I mean, by the way, I believe that many of the things we're here talking about apply to caregiving in a whole range of situations. I think there are some unique contingencies with respect to mental illness that perhaps we ought to mention. But I think the dilemma for lots of people, and the reason that it takes so long to come to realize, to be convinced of the correctness of the 4 C's, is that people are driven by love, they're driven by compassion, they're driven by emotion rather than simply reason. It's very, very difficult to watch a child that is ill and to be told by somebody, say perhaps to be told by a psychiatrist, you've got to back off of this a little bit. It would be better if you backed off of this. It would be better for both you and your child.
But is there such a thing as, for example, a predictable course? Like, does it take most of your group members a year or so to kind of begin to realize that they didn't cause it?
Yeah, I guess I would hesitate to put clear timetables on it, because my observation in that group is that there are people who've been in that group for 10 years who are really veterans. I mean, these are people who have gotten great sustenance. And by the way, I would also want to say that support groups are enormously important. If people say to me, how does one go about coping with mental illness, I would say one thing that you ought to really do is get to a place where people are speaking the same language, where people can understand each other, because often outside the family, there's very little in the way of sympathy being given to caregivers. So I hear people who have been in this group for 10 years, who truly are veterans, and they're still in the process of trying to incorporate these things.
That's toughie.
It's a toughie. It really is a toughie. And I think The burden comes when people are driven by love and compassion, can't gain distance, and they begin, and as I said at the beginning, I think they do begin to be swallowed up. And I think that this actually becomes a criterion for some people about when they must actually leave a relationship. Now, it's awfully difficult for parents to leave children. That doesn't happen. But spouses are not bound to each other forever. And these are people who have hung in there. These are 60 people who've hung in there. I have no way of knowing how representative this sample is. It may very well be that the sample is not representative. Maybe most people in America sort of skip out when the going gets tough. But I think when people decide that they really have to distance themselves, there are two things that happen. One is they've tried everything they can to solve this problem, to make this thing go away, and it hasn't, and they realize the permanency. But the second thing, I think, that makes people back off finally is when they realize that they're losing their own identities, that they're losing their own selves in this process. And maybe it is the case. This is not a happy conclusion to make, that maybe people really do begin to incorporate some of these things when they themselves begin to get sick, when they themselves simply can't continue the way that they have been continuing. And simply to save themselves, they have to move into a different mode with this. So it would really be nice if we could say that there was some predictability about when persons move from feelings of sympathy to anger, to other emotions, and as I said earlier, even at some point to feelings of hate. And this gets very complicated because here are people who are sometimes feeling hate towards somebody that they're supposed to love, and then there's a second order of emotions of feeling embarrassment about an emotion that they feel that they think they ought not to be feeling.
Well, maybe we'll get to that in the next segment, but back to the I can't cure it. That also is a toughie. I mean, because I know that many families really throw themselves heart and soul into the curing phase. And obviously, sometimes, I suppose they're successful, but often, many times, they realize that they're not successful. Maybe you could comment on that. We have about a minute left.
Yeah. Well, I think people are torn between two rhetorics about mental illness. The one, which is I think the dominant rhetoric in the United States today, which is the rhetoric that mental illness is a biological disorder, and so it is a brain disease. And so most people, I think, buy that idea. But when you begin to talk with them in depth about this, while they acknowledge that, they also begin to talk about stress, they begin to talk about environmental factors. And so as soon as environmental factors enter into the equation, well, then it opens the door to the possibility that they somehow may have caused it and are therefore responsible for somehow curing it. So I think it's a difficult thing for people themselves to theorize about the causes of mental illness. Their response to a person is, of course, based on the theories that they eventually come to have about this.
But obviously, the life experience is kind of confounding, because if it's biologic, then hopefully there's a simple fix. On the other hand, a young fellow who is so depressed over the loss of his father, hard to attribute that to biology, and his family struggles with how can they help him.
And I think
get
that
over
patients are confused by this. I think that doctors are confused by this. And I think families are confused by this. We will never resolve, I don't believe, the mixture of these
the
things.
nature-nurture issues. Right. Well, maybe after the break we can go back to what you refer to in your book as the emotional economy, how people handle their reactions.
Sure.
We'll take a break. Thank you.
I want to start investing. I heard about these new inflation-indexed I-bonds from the U.S. Treasury that guarantee a return above inflation.
Well, we don't offer them, but there's this new stock.
It guarantees a return.
Guarantee? There are no guarantees, but...
Well, there are with I-bonds. They guarantee a real return beyond inflation.
Well... Hey, George. Oh, what, are you worried about a little blip in the market? Can I call you back? Okay.
I should tell you that I'm not comfortable with risk.
Well, what's a little risk?
I don't think you understand.
Wow.
Look, I want an investment that's guaranteed to stay ahead of inflation like the I-bond, but safe like the I-bond, that lets me save money on my state and local income taxes like the I-bond, and will let me get started with as little as $50.
Like the I-bond.
Right.
What if you were in trouble? Where would you turn? In communities around the country, there is help available. Volunteers of America has been helping people build better lives for over 100 years. One of the nation's largest nonprofit charitable organizations, Volunteers of America builds stronger communities, restoring confidence and self-reliance to help people help themselves. Reaching out to abused and neglected children and families. Caring for the special needs of the elderly and disabled. Providing services to people who are homeless and in poverty. Across the nation, Volunteers of America helped over 1.5 million people last year. There are no limits to what can be done. Find out how you can help change lives in your community. Call 1-800-899-0089. Volunteers of America. There are no limits to caring.
So we were talking about the 4 C's and the process that caregivers, caretakers go through. And obviously that's very emotionally draining. And you talk in your book about an emotional economy. Perhaps you could talk some about that.
Yeah, I actually steal the notion of emotional economy from a colleague by the name of Candace Clark, who's written a book on sympathy, a really wonderful book. And she actually uses the metaphor of an economy. And I think that maybe the central idea here about this economy, like any other economy, is that there's got to be some kind of reciprocity. We measure whether we're getting the right stuff for what we're giving out, you know, in any economy. And I think that this idea of an emotional economy is particularly interesting and problematic in the case of mental illness in this respect. While I think I mentioned a few moments ago that I think there are lots of parallels between a whole variety of illnesses and the caregiving problems, and I think whether it's dealing with somebody who has cancer or dealing with an Alzheimer's person or a patient, these problems are the same. But I think the economy is different in the case of mental illness in this respect. For most illnesses, patients are able to abide by what sociologists would call the sick role. You know how to behave as a sick person. There are norms about how a sick person is supposed to behave. And there really is reciprocity in most cases.
Meaning?
Meaning that when you give help to somebody, they are thankful for the help. They are able to respond to the help that you're giving. There's some kind of equity in terms of what you're giving and what you're getting back. And I think that among the really unique contingencies of mental illness is that you are often dealing, too often I'm afraid to say, at least in the stories I heard, with people who are recalcitrant. I think it's the character of mental illness that people often deny that they are ill. People can be doing, of course, the most extraordinary things and believing that there's nothing wrong with them and it's everybody else who really has the problem. That even when persons do acknowledge that they have an illness, they are often not compliant with medications. So they're not doing what doctors are asking them to do. This, too, is a very complicated thing because I have heard people in this group say, listen, I got very angry at my brother or my child or my wife for not being compliant with medication, and then I started taking some medications, and I see the side effects, and for the first time I understand why they might not be compliant. But the fact remains that people are often not compliant, and also they are often treating their family caregivers as the enemy. I mean, they're behaving in ways that are expressing an enormous amount of anger towards them. So what you're talking about is an economy that is sort of lopsided in the sense that we expect equity, we expect a measure of democracy in what we give and what we get, a sort of a distributive justice, you might say, in the economy. And so I think that the whole array of emotions that caregivers feel in this context partly come from an illness that is, first of all, not that easily curable, and one where the normal quid pro quo between a caregiver
breaks down.
Yeah, breaks down. And so it fosters, again later on in this process, really difficult emotions. And as I said, probably the most difficult is feeling that people sometimes hate the person they're supposed to love. This is, I might just say that this is for me one of the reasons that one of the things my biggest hope for this book is that people will hear the voices of the people that I interviewed. If I could just speak to that for 1 second, I'd like to, because as I understand my own work, it's the voices of the people that I interviewed that are central. Mm-hmm. I mean, they are the expert. I hope that I'm a good sociological guide in making sense of the patterns in their words. I actually feel uncomfortable when I talk about my work. I mean, here you and I have been talking, and most of the words that I'm saying are my words, mm-hmm. and I hope I'm being accurate in conveying what these people have had to say. But it really is the words of the people that are central, and this book is filled with their words. And to me, while I don't have the answers to this, I don't think anybody has the answer to how to make this whole thing work. What I do believe, and really for me, one of the most gratifying things about having written this book and also having written Speaking of Sadness, are the letters that I get from people and the emails that I get from people where they say, thank you so much for writing this book. Just hearing other people speak has been liberating. I picked up the book hoping that you were going to give me answers. Mm. There are no real answers. But I do want you to know that this book has made me feel that I'm not alone with this. It has made me feel, some people say it's made me feel that I'm not crazy. Because you see, when you're in the middle of these sorts of things, the experiences that you have feel so completely idiosyncratic. You feel as though nobody in the world could possibly be feeling what it is that you are feeling.
And you're ashamed of what you're feeling.
And you're ashamed of what you're feeling and so on and so forth. And you're feeling, just I don't want to dwell on the hate thing, but you're feeling hatred towards somebody and feeling terrible about that. And then my job as a social scientist, and this is, I think, part of the power and value of social science, is to step back, to listen well to what people have had to say. I mean, this thing generated 4,000 pages of transcript, I can't write 4,000 pages, so I've had to be selective about this. But to see patterns. And what you realize is that even in the most chaotic human experiences, that there is an order even in chaos. Mm-hmm. And when people read other people expressing exactly the same emotions that they have themselves been feeling, and feel that they're the only ones that have had these emotions, it's incredibly liberating. And I would like to think that one of the values of the book is that it might, in fact, help people to that fifth C that I think I should now bring back to this group, the C of,
being convinced.
Convinced, yes, and to realize that when they are stumbling along and don't know how to draw those boundary lines, and it's confusing to them, and all of the frustration and so forth, that there is a process to this, that there is a pattern to it. It's not, again, a pattern that has 6 months right here and then you move into the next one. It's not that neat. But it is liberating to realize that you share a lot in common. This is, again, why I would go back to the great value of support groups, yes. And I think that can be healing for people, aside from the just rich body of knowledge that people share with each other about what they do to make themselves feel better and to deal better with this. I mean, there are people who feel that they can't even take vacations, I mean, there are folks in this group who are afraid of leaving even for a couple of weeks for fear of what might happen while they're gone. And then when people finally do at the urgings of the group, take a vacation, and people applaud in the group. But they applaud not just because the person has gotten the strength to do this, but because it's an object lesson for all of them. They're all struggling with these issues of trying to have the right balance of closeness and distance.
But are there some people who can't take a vacation?
There are people who are unable to bring themselves to do it. Yes, I mean, it's again the 4 C's and whether you can incorporate this thing or not. You know, some of the stories are extremely difficult in terms of these decisions. I recall, I don't think it's in the book, but I recall a woman saying that she has a daughter living in Montana who's been suicidal for a number of years, being treated for mental illness. And the daughter has routinely demanded money from them. In a way, she may even have used the word extortion in the group. And so for years, because the daughter has been threatening suicide, the parents, whenever she blows the money, and maybe in an episode of mania, goes and spends money wildly and kinds of things that people do during periods of mania, calls up, and the parents realize that, we go back to this word enabling, they realize that they're enabling the daughter by sending the money, but they're also afraid of what will happen if they don't send the money. So one night in the group, the parent says, I finally made the decision. I've been listening in this group, and I have been hearing the message that I'm not doing my daughter a favor, and I'm not doing myself a favor here, and I'm going to stop sending the money. Now, it's a brave decision to make, and this speaks to the difficulty of the closeness and distance. It is a brave decision to make, and my perspective is probably the right one to make.
Just approximately how many years into the process are they?
Oh, this is 5, 6 years into the process.
A long time.
Long time. But here's the dilemma. Here's the ultimate dilemma. Even believing that she has made the right choice, what this mother fears is one day hearing that her daughter has committed suicide. Now, on the one hand, we know the statistics here. We're talking about deadly illnesses. I read recently, which was almost hard to believe, that with manic depression and schizophrenia, is it possible that it's actually 1 out of 6 is a plausible rate, a mortality rate? That seemed high to me. It may not be 1 out of 6, but it's very high. It's very high. Yeah. And so this parent has to live with the recognition that she has a daughter who has a potentially deadly illness. She is doing the right thing in terms of this relationship, I believe. But if the kid ever were to take her life, even believing you'd done the right thing, you'd have to live for the rest of your life with the lingering doubt about whether you...
So you're damned if you do and damned if you don't.
Yeah, and so this is why the idea of drawing these lines with any measure of firmness is almost impossible. And of course, mental illness changes over time, and people have periods of respite from it. There are moments when people are in the middle of it, and then it's time-bounded, and then they can behave perfectly normally for a period of time. And then there's another episode, then the medications kick in, and things are okay again for a while, and it's so unpredictable in that respect. So that too wreaks havoc with any effort to sort of draw the line, one time in a way that will work for all time. It just doesn't.
In a way, you can almost, if you could tag hope, the rise and fall of hope is so central to this process. And maybe we can touch upon that in our final segment. We do have to take a break at this point. Thank you, David.
Welcome an exchange student into your family. Learn about another culture in a fun and exciting way with Youth for Understanding International Exchange.
I'm finding myself wanting to learn more and more about other countries, and it's really interesting.
I love learning new things and sharing my cultures.
These students bring something to the school that doesn't come from books.
While your exchange student brings their world and customs into your lives, you get to share our great country with them.
I guess I only thought you could love your own.
but it's just been a great experience for all of us.
Go global. Call 1-800-TEENAGE for this free booklet. Learn how you can welcome a Youth for Understanding exchange student into your community.
We've learned so much, and very close friends of ours have now decided to host also.
Imagine a world in which it doesn't matter who you are, rich or poor, girl or boy, from the city or the country, black or white, African, Asian, American, or European. All you want is to learn. It's time for a global learning network, linking students and teachers around the world for collaborative learning, sharing ideas, exchanging knowledge, training, teaching, learning, bridging the gap, bringing the world home. World Links for Development can make it happen with your help. Support World Links for Development, opening a world of learning.
We're not just imagining it, we're doing it.
On the web at worldbank.org/worldlinks.
I don't say this, David, to compliment you, but I have indeed recommended your book to at least 5 people in the last 10 days because I think it's a topic that it's so helpful to just discuss it without necessarily having, solutions. And maybe we ought to talk a little bit about what you talk about in your book, the institutional journey. Perhaps you could explain it. What happens when people meet the likes of me? What happens when they indeed have to get acquainted with what is left of the institutions that provide care to people who are out of control? Maybe we could talk about that.
I was doing an interview, I think, the other day on radio, and somebody asked me what was the thing that surprised me the most in what I'd been learning in all of this. And, of course, the complexity of the stories is probably the first thing. But the second thing, I think, is how incredibly difficult it is to understand the mental health system. And I haven't made systematic efforts to understand. It's almost like trying to learn Greek, and I'm not prepared to do it yet. But as I listened, and now again, listening for more than 4 years, and people come in, and even people who are, again, veterans seem to not be able to figure out the system. And when I hear the stories, it sounds bewildering to me. I can't even follow the stories that people are telling. So my impression, and I don't want to be definitive about this because I'm not in the system myself, but it seems to me that the system there's a paradox in the system, and the paradox is that everybody who is part of the system, I think, genuinely wants to help people who are ill. I think the motives of the people who are involved in the system, from social workers to psychiatrists to clerks sitting at desks, and I think everybody has the same goal in mind. But it seems to me from the outside that the system is so balkanized. It's as though it's made up of multiple cultures where people are speaking sort of different dialects of the same language.
Absolutely.
And I hear stories of people calling up in the morning. We all these days get onto a phone tree in institutions, and literally spending the whole day trying to figure out who to get the right information from, and then ending up with the person that they began with, and it's just totally bewildering. The chapter in the book deals with a number of tasks that people who, of course, enter the system in one way or another have to face. One is dealing immediately with crisis, which means dealing with local police, with the court system, and
crisis teams,
that sort of thing. The second task that people have to face is the task of getting people into the hospital, which I'd like to return to because I think this is really important. The third task is finding doctors with whom they can work, and the last task is paying for it. I mean, the insurance system is just probably the most bewildering, absolutely bewildering part of this. I mean, there are things that you just seem to have to know. You apply for disability, and if you refuse disability, if you just walk away, you're supposed to appeal it. It's kind of like the presidential process that's going on. You just keep appealing everything. But if you don't know these sort of hidden rules, you just would sort of walk away and say, well, I guess I can't get insurance. I think the hospitalization thing is something that might be worth talking about, because this is also a huge problem, and I don't really know how to think about it exactly, because at least in Massachusetts, and again, tell me where I go wrong with this, but the standard for getting people into the hospital is the criterion that I imagine folks like you must use is this person a danger to themselves or a danger to other people? And the terribly frustrating thing from the point of view of family is that they have somebody in their family who's behaving in a clearly psychotic fashion, but has not been judged as a danger to themselves or a danger to another person. The person does not want voluntarily to go into the hospital, and so you can't involuntarily commit them to a hospital unless they're judged to be a danger to themselves or to somebody else. And so one of the hugely difficult things, I think, for family members is that sometimes the only time that their family member gets into the hospital is when the shoe really drops. And so people are sitting around waiting for something really awful to happen, where a person does finally hurt themselves or assault somebody else. And so, to me, and I don't know exactly how to think about this, there is this delicate tension between, on the one hand, respecting the civil rights of all human beings, but on the other hand, respecting the rights of families who are sometimes being terrorized by a person who denies that they're ill and can't get into a hospital. I think there are people these days who are talking about a middle ground where they're talking about community commitment, where people are, they may not reach the level of the judgment of their being dangerous to other people or to themselves, but are clearly psychotic, can be committed, at least for a period of time, to get them stabilized on medication and then hopefully taken care of, obliged to see people in the community.
Well, there's no question involuntary treatment works, whether it's outpatient or inpatient. I mean, sometimes the best thing that can happen to I call them patients, is in fact to have an extended probation with a probation officer who takes the requirement of outpatient treatment seriously. So there was a day when everybody would wink, you know, and they'd require someone to see a therapist, but they never checked and they never cared whether they kept their appointments or not. It does work, and many times people need to be able to say, basically, I'm here because the judge sent me, and then surprisingly make very good use of the time and the services that you make available to them. The danger to self or others is the standard under Chapter 123. However, you know, I'm not a lawyer, I'm a psychiatrist, and I have plenty of discretion. The problem is that the tensions are very often with the crisis team, and they've been on this show, and the families, because if a crisis team responds, when a crisis team responds, very often they don't see the crisis. It's past. You know, so they're hearing about it.
Certainly it is true that over and over again people say that when somebody does finally get hospitalized, it is an incredible relief. At least they are safe, they say over and over again. At least they are safe. And it's a respite for them. But then, you know, then you get into the business of insurance. And how long will insurance allow people to stay in the hospital?
Because the frustration is very often that the family member comes home 3 days later and at least manifestly is angry that there's been a violation.
And 3 days is not enough time to stabilize somebody. And so we've got this really odd system where people get into the hospital finally. It seems like a victory. And then they're only allowed to stay for a week or 2 weeks or whatever the insurance covers, and they're back out and they're not really stabilized, and the problem is being handed back to the family. Now, here's something also that I think about, and I don't really know how to solve this problem. And it is that family members feel that they are cut out of the informational loop frequently.
Tough one.
And it is a tough one, because I imagine that when you start dealing with a patient who's over 18 years old, who's an adult, and says, I don't want you telling my family what's going on between us, that you have to respect that. But then, from the family's point of view, the problem gets handed back to them, and sometimes they don't even, as they tell me the story, don't even know what the diagnosis is. I mean, I hear stories of parents who find a bottle of pills, call up a pharmacy, and say, what are these pills for? And they're told, people who are schizophrenic take these pills, and this is the first time that they know that the person in their life is schizophrenic.
Well, that's a glitch in the system, because I think that we practitioners can find a happier medium where we're respecting privacy, confidentiality, and at the same time being cordial and available to families. The way I go about it is I will respect a patient's wishes, obviously, and when family members want to talk to me, I insist that it be with the patient present, so I don't have, you know, private meetings with family members unless it's an unusual circumstance. But I want the patient there to then bear witness to everything that they say, I say, that he may well, he or she may well want to say. But
I don't want to indict psychiatry, but I wish there were more doctors who are behaving themselves the way you're describing. Because
but it's tricky, because this daughter I told you called me yesterday and wanted to talk at great length about her father. Now, her father is my patient, and technically I can listen till hell freezes over.
Right.
But there's really a limit to how much sharing.
I hear that.
What I was able to do, though, was really kind of help her get in touch with some of her own observations about her dad. And so I think she felt it was a useful conversation, which was really a roundabout way of trying to justify why some of the medications that he was taking, in very low doses, by the way, were indeed very helpful to him and not causing the problem that was her
Well, the
wish.
more information that family members can get within the boundaries of propriety, they ought to be getting, because their perspective is that the problem is continually being handed back to them, and they don't know how to deal with it. And I would like, you know, after the deinstitutionalization movement, when the antipsychotic medications promised to allow us to treat people outside, the hope was that there would be a robust system of community mental health, an infrastructure that would support the family and somehow or other work in that fashion. It never materialized.
And you know something? It's so simple. It never materialized. It was never funded.
It was never funded.
On the other hand, I mean, we're not talking about rocket science. We're talking about the application of common sense to community-based programming.
We're not going to have time for this. My book is concerned fundamentally with two questions. What do I owe myself? What do I owe another person? People grapple with that. But there is a third question. And the third question is, what does society, government, owe me? What does it owe the person in my family who is ill? I think we're living in a world, these are the debates that we're in the middle of about what is the role of government, but I think that the family is going to flounder. We have to, I'm not a politician, but I believe that we have to arrive at a moment where American society and the government and our policymakers realize that if they don't do what they have to nurture the health of the family, the health of the country and the health of individuals is caught up with that. And I think we need to somehow move to this infrastructure of community supports that we were promised was going to be there at an earlier point in time and never materialized, because the family can only deal with so many stresses on it. Like it's a system like any other system, and it's going to break down, and we can't use the language of family values, which is, I believe in family values, but it can also be an insidious way of just throwing everything back onto the family, saying it's the family's problem.
Sure.
And so I think this kind of institutional, political, monetary support, I would hope somewhere in the future would be part of the picture.
Me too. Well, listen, thank you. We do have to stop. On behalf of the Norfolk Alliance, I want to thank you for being here. Very helpful, and very much appreciate your book and recommend it, The Burden of Sympathy. Thank you.
Thanks.